Education has been very feminized during my lifetime. I did a video review of Helen Andrews' The Great Feminization a while ago. At 35 minutes, it's too long to present at Toastmasters, and the topic is really too toxic. Talking about women doesn't go over big at Toastmasters. But her theme is that there are a great many spheres in all of our lives being feminized. That's corporations, law, medicine, military, police, and education, probably the earliest and the most of all. And I have a lifetime experience with education, so I'm going to talk about it. Let's go back to evolutionary history. Men evolved to defend the tribe, we're the warriors, to bring home the meat, we're the hunters, and to lead the tribe. And women evolved to bear and rear the children of the whole tribe and to support their men, support the tribe. There's a vast difference in parenthood, which is that the women know which children are theirs. The men in a tribal society didn't, because marriage wasn't a particularly strong thing. Any child born to the tribe was welcome in the tribe, and the men didn't really know which were theirs, but they knew what tribe they belonged to. So the men had their loyalty and their interest in the whole tribe, and the women in their children. And that comes through in our moral thinking. Jonathan Haidt's 5 moral foundations say that the first 2 are care and harm avoidance. Everybody cares about their fellow human beings, especially for the children, want to keep them out of harm, men and women alike, although women more than men seem to be involved in it, and fairness. We want to treat them all fairly. A mother has to treat her children fairly. Now, men looking at a tribal level, those are the individual virtues. Men working at a tribal level are more interested in the group morals, the group foundations, such as loyalty to the group. If somebody is not loyal to the group, a fighter isn't willing to fight for the group, you have a big problem. That's a men's problem. Somebody is in charge of the group, he's the authority, and there are rules and procedures run by the group, and recognizing that authority is something that affects the men more than the women. And likewise, there are certain things that the group holds sacred. Jews and Muslims avoid eating pork. It identifies you with a group. So it's a group thing. These are more male than female. So with the feminization, the individual virtues have taken precedence over the group virtues, and that's part of the thesis. And women have remade institutions to reflect women's values. They have compassionate policies. They have a preoccupation with trauma. Oh, the poor little deer got hurt. It may be physically hurt or maybe just hurt feelings. Women are more concerned about it than men. Men will say, man up and get over it. The women aren't like that. Women are much more concerned about painful utterances, about hurt feelings. And women, thus, are involved in the language police. You can't use hurtful language, and they forbid you to call people queer or something like that because you'll hurt their feelings. Women have, in the interests of avoiding harm, expanded welfare. So anybody who's down on their luck, don't blame it on alcoholism, don't blame it on being lazy, blame it on something and support them so that they don't starve to death. So expanded welfare has been a female project. Expanded civil rights has been a female project. Some groups do better than others. But women, out of a sense of fairness, want to see everybody succeed equally, even though people are not the same. In America, we have Chinese, Jews, white people, Hispanics, blacks. They all succeed at different levels, but the women want to believe that they're all equal. And they want civil rights to ensure that they're equal. Here in Ukraine, we have, for instance, Jews and Gypsies. I don't think that there's a teacher here in Ukraine who would not have different expectations for a Jew and a Gypsy, but that's the way things are in the United States. So they have things like affirmative action, open door immigration, a theory that they're all the same. It hasn't worked. In fact, in 2015, very famously, Angela Merkel invited 1 million Muslims to Germany, and she said, "Wir schaffen das," we will do it. Less than a decade later, she said, multiculturalism doesn't work. They had not done it, and they had a true mess with 1 million Muslims that didn't want to become German. Too much sympathy. There's the Me Too thing, which kind of undermines the law, because they say, believe all women, and the women say outrageous things to try to, for instance, discredit President Trump or Clarence Thomas or Roberts for the Supreme Court, and they all want to be believed just because they're women. You can't do that. You have to apply the law fairly and evenly. Feminism kind of gets in the way of that. Feminism has a global mission. Here in Ukraine, we have seen the pride flag flying from the American embassy. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. And we have seen the American embassy, USAID, plaster the Kiev metro with signs of men holding hands and saying, "Get tested for AIDS." Ukraine is simply not interested in all of these gay issues, but it's part of the feminist agenda, and our government is therefore pushing it on you in Ukraine. You really should resent it. Feminism, this is me talking, chooses to ignore restraints. You ignore budgets, and school budgets are a big case in point. Because of the sense of fairness and justice, they demand more money for teachers, whether or not local budgets can support it. And local budgets are out of control in feminist-led jurisdictions. They ignore differences in human abilities. I just mentioned differences in races, but even differences within a single race. They want everybody to compete as if they're equal. They refuse to recognize human differences. They ignore issues of practicality. A big one had to do with civil rights. A couple decades ago, they insisted that black and white children needed to study together. And to achieve this, they bussed black children into white schools, white children into black schools, even though the kids didn't particularly want to move and they didn't want to spend an hour each way on the bus going back and forth, and they didn't really get along terribly well when they were together. But the people who did it felt morally superior because they had done the right thing, regardless of the practicality. Now, I have seen the feminization of education. I entered school 80 years ago, and I've been a student, a teacher, a parent. I've been part of school leadership. I was a treasurer of 2 private schools. I was a student at the College of Education. And I've reviewed a lot of books on education. So feminism has affected me. I've seen it up close. Let me tell you what I have seen over the course of the decades. Here the blue represents men, the pink represents women, and women have become a majority in American universities in the last 30 years or so. They were a majority of teachers, particularly elementary and high school, 50 years ago. They have become a majority of the administrators in schools in the past 20 years, and they're a majority of the professors in college just in the last decade. And they're certainly a dominant force in the bureaucracy that oversees the schools, and particularly the teachers' unions. The two major teachers' unions in America, the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, are dominated, and have been for a long time, by outright Marxist women union presidents. And they push absolutely for pay for the teachers without concern for the students. This was really visible during COVID. The teachers' unions wanted to stay home to prevent themselves from being exposed to COVID. Parents and even a number of governors said, send them to school, let the kids go to school. They will suffer if they don't get the education. And suffer they did because they didn't get the education. Well, the teachers' unions were adamantly against letting the kids study during COVID. That's just a case in point. Looking out for their own. So what's changed? Well, there have been changes in all sorts of areas. The objectives of education, curriculum, grading standards, discipline has changed remarkably. Student achievement has changed, and women's dominance, of course, is a big change I'm talking about. Let me tell you about 4 historical epochs. My grandparents' and parents' generation, they were mostly male school teachers, and they prepared people to be soldiers, voters, and leaders. Particularly leaders, because only in the 19th century, only 5-10% people went to college, and the leaders were the ones who went to college, the doctors, lawyers, and so on. They had corporal punishment, the hickory stick, to enforce discipline. The students were boys. Boys can be rambunctious, and they had punishment to keep the rambunctious boys in line. It only made sense. It's right out of the Bible. Spare the rod and spoil the child. There was no compulsory attendance. If you didn't feel like going, goodbye. We don't need you. If you're not here to study, go away. And the academic curriculum in the 19th century was pretty old-fashioned. It was classic Greek, Latin languages, mathematics. And in the early 20th century, they added history, science, and modern languages, German, French, Spanish. My education in California was a little bit changed from that. Education had become mandatory 20 or 30 years earlier. Therefore, we had students who were going on to college and students who were not. So we had an academic track, the one I was on, to go to college, a vocational track for people who wouldn't. The vocational track focused on manual arts, working with wood, working with metal for the boys, and cooking, sewing, housekeeping for the girls. Corporal punishment was still around. My grammar school principal had a wooden board on his wall called the Board of Education. He used it to paddle the bad boys. Kim, Nikki, and Norris down the street from me were bad boys, and they were very familiar with the Board of Education. We had history, language, and science. The majority of the teachers were women. I had one man in 6th grade, but the majority of the administrators were still male. This had changed quite a bit By the time I had my first family in the 1990s, women dominated. And they were interested in equity, not achievement. I know this because I was the treasurer of the school board of 2 private schools. And they were very, very interested in black kids. They wanted to admit visible diversity. They wanted to have a picture of their student body with a lot of smiling black faces in there. So we dedicated 10% of our budget to scholarships for minority children. And although I was on the board, I was never permitted to ask. I never thought about asking how the black students did. It was pretty obvious. They were in the class with my kids. I heard how they did, but nobody followed through because the objective was equity. And the curriculum, and this was more in the public schools than the private, but in both, was really expressly anti-American. They talked about how evil traditional Americans had been in slavery, treatment of the American Indians, treatment of the Japanese and Manzanar in World War II, and how evil white men had been in treatment of women. My daughter Susie came home telling me how men had habitually always beat their wives and refused them rights. I asked her if she'd seen any of it in her own family, her grandparents, uncles, aunts. No, she hadn't, but that was dogma, and she believed it. And we had explicit sex education, not appropriate in my opinion. They showed the kids how to put a condom on a banana in school. And they told them that homosexuality was just a choice. When a doctor among the parents raised the issue that social diseases are much more common among gays than among straights, they shouted him down in a meeting of parents. They didn't want to hear it. Now, allowing these kids to take sexual risks was one thing, but physical risk was another thing. They eliminated dodgeball and any sort of sport that might have been dangerous for the kids. They refused to let the kids walk to school because they might get hit by a car. So you wound up with a generation of fat, out-of-shape kids. And they had therapy for everybody. There was a psychologist on the school staff. There were speech therapists and every imaginable therapist. They diagnosed a large percentage of the kids with attention deficit disorder, gave them pills and all sorts of stuff. And you were kind of special if you were diagnosed with one of these things, and it gave you an advantage because you got to take untimed tests and so on. The results for education were kind of disastrous. Today's United States continues that trajectory. Since then, there have been a lot of school shootings, and they have metal detectors at the doors of the schools. It's kind of like a prison walking in. The schools are dangerous because they're majority minority, and not all minorities are as nice as people like your kids and mine. Test scores have fallen continually. Things like the National Assessment of Student Progress, the Program International for Student Achievement, college admission tests, SAT and ACT, have all fallen. Somebody testified in the Senate that 60% of Americans today cannot read at a 6th grade level. And nobody contradicted him because it's true. There's a lot of gender confusion. The schools encourage homosexuality, they encourage transsexuals, and they actively protect children that they encourage to try these variants by not telling their parents that they're doing it. So if a kid says he's transsexual, it's, shh, don't tell mommy and daddy. They might not approve. Yeah, mommy and daddy might not approve of your experimenting with being transsexual and getting your body carved up to reflect that. It's a disaster. It's anti-white and anti-male, as I repeatedly said, and not surprisingly, there's declining enrollment because not everybody likes this. Now, I'm happy to say that Ukraine looks a lot like America in the 1950s, the curriculum that I grew up with. I'm happy with the education my kids are getting here. American schooling is dominated by agendas. The teachers' union, looking for money for the teachers, don't care about the kids very much. We have a Department of Education, which is kind of a careerist thing, and state educational associations, the same thing. You have Bill Gates putting his hand in education, same way he puts his hand in with vaccines, global warming, and everything else, never for the good. And the colleges of education, as I said, dominated by Marxists. The thing I enjoyed there was getting them mad by telling them the truth, as I had seen it over the course of 60 years. I called the men in the College of Education white mice because they were constant fear, trembling for the women. And the woman in charge, one of my women professors, is now in charge of the University of Maryland College Park campus, the main campus. Being a feminist pays its rewards. So what's the reaction to all this? There's an exodus from the public schools. People are going to private schools, religious schools, homeschooling. And this includes not just whites, but blacks who are serious about getting their kids educated, because blacks have a way of pulling each other down. Any smart black kid gets accused of acting white, and a black parent who wants a good education for his kid has a terrible time. And homeschooling is a big thing. I was involved with them in Washington, D.C. The establishment resists. They make it very hard to take your kids out of public school, particularly in the liberal states in the United States, and it is against the law in Germany and Sweden and some other countries. How does this end? For the schools, enrollment's declining, funding is drying up, and when the Great Depression comes and there isn't any money, I think it will end badly. The two-income trap is ending because taxes are so high that it doesn't make sense for a wife to work, and if she likes her children and wants to educate them, she's better off homeschooling them. And people are moving out of the blue states, that's the liberal states in the United States, in droves, California, New York, Pennsylvania. They're moving out to the red states where the kids can get a decent public education. And they're moving out of England, Germany, Sweden to woke Europe where they can still get a reasonable education. Other industries are following the pattern of education. Some of them find it easier to move than others. Software is easy to move because it's all brain power, and Ukraine has benefited a great deal. They don't have diversity measures, and they're not asking how many people of which color are working as programmers. They care whether they can program. The same with engineering. So the disease that has affected education is affecting other industries that are a little bit later. Will the situation rectify itself? I hope that it will in the United States. But whatever, you here in Ukraine, please pay attention. Don't let it happen here. Don't let this madness destroy Ukraine. Madam Toastmaster.